Okay, this is the last week of class, so you know what that means, right? It's time for the final exam. Okay, now you've heard me tell you this before, that I use my lecture notes to build these test questions, so that's exactly what I did. I went through the lecture notes for chapters 7 through 13, and I created some test questions out of that. So it would probably be smart for you to go look at those lecture notes as well. Plus, you should probably review all the quizzes, the previous quizzes from the midterm on. Yes, do watch the videos, the review videos that you're clearly watching now. Do study for and take the final exam. That makes sense. Here's a note, though, that you absolutely positively have to have this thing turned in on time. I'm going to have practically no time at all that next Monday morning when I have to turn in your grade. So anything late is going to get a 0. Okay, so let's just go through the list of topics that may appear on the exam. This is kind of, the rules basically haven't changed since the last time we did this. So let's just go through the list. So yes, this is, they're not comprehensive, so we're only covering chapters 7 through 13. It's open book, open internet, open everything, right? There's no limits on what you can do to go to see. There's going to be 40 questions in the pool, but you're only going to get 25 of them. Well, 27 if you count the extra credit questions that everyone gets. So I have 40 questions on this list that's going to get pulled from, and I never know which one of the 25 are you going to get. I never know what order they're going to appear in. So that's why I include the chapter and page number not only in this little topic list, but also on the exam, to provide you perhaps a little bit of context where you could flip to that page and go, oh, that's what he's talking about. Now, once again, it doesn't mean that the question came from that page or the answer appears on that page. It's really to provide you context. Like if I said, supply chain, and you go, well, we talked about supply chain back in chapter 4. So you would pop on over to, chapter 9, page 423 and go, oh, okay, I know what he's talking about. Okay, that's the whole point. As always, there's going to be a section here where it was not adequately covered in the book, and so I put a no in here, meaning that, yeah, we talked about it in lecture, and it's probably in the lecture notes, but it's not going to be in the book. Okay, and once again, about 20% of the material we talk about on these exams did not come from the book. It is time, just like before, you have an hour and 15 minutes to complete this thing. So 25 questions plus 2 makes 27. You can do the math and figure out, how to set your cadence on which questions. If you're one of those people who agonize over the short answer ones, maybe you ought you can sort the list, so to speak, and so you can do all the true false first and all the multiple choice first, and then work on the short answer ones at the end. That's your choice. I'm not trying to tell you how to do things. Okay. I'm going to go through this and just kind of give you a hint on what it is this whole questions are going to be about. So here we go. So the first one's talking about IP addresses. And if you recall from lecture, we talked about how IP addresses are assigned, and there's the old style ones that have run out, and then we have the longer ones that are now available. And the reason why we run out is because there's all these umpteen gazillion devices, and when they're exposed to the internet, they all have to be unique. I also talked about there's a technique where not all IP addresses need to be unique. You could have what's called shared IP addresses, like inside my house. I don't have IP address for every single machine in my house. They all just share one IP address coming in from my internet service provider. And so I may ask you a little bit about how that works or what that's called. The next one basically talks about, like the difference between HTML and HTTP. What do they do? One is for like a protocol for transferring web requests, and the other is a markup language for making things look pretty. So yeah, that. Web 2.0. Now we've had a lot of these, so the question's probably going to be somewhat the same about, what's the most significant feature of Web 2.0, or just define what Web 2.0 actually means in the real world. No marketing bullshit, but what's it really mean? Network types. Remember we had the extranet and the intranet and the internet? Yeah, if you can remember those 3 terms, you're good to go. E-commerce types. Remember the business to business and business to consumer and consumer to consumer. Again, if you can remember those three categories, you're good to go. Comparison. So there was a cool little chart that I kind of liked, and I pointed out in lecture. Reference, what's the length of time it takes to set up an arrangement for B2B or B2C or whatever. And, what's the dollar amount. So if you can remember that, you'll be in good shape. E-commerce is not all perfect. There's an awful lot of people that completely that don't trust e-commerce at all. They will refuse to put their credit card number anywhere on the web. I'm going to ask you some questions regarding that. The next one talks about search engine optimization. And I mentioned, I told you guys in lecture that in the old days, you could kind of game the system. You can go in there and put keywords and metadata and all sorts of cool things in there in order to artificially raise your ranking on a Google search, for example. And pretty much all those things have been closed for us now. But I'm going to ask you some questions about search engine optimization. The next one talks about those digital certificates. You know how when I go to a web page and it says that it's from Amazon, I could check the certificate to see if it really is from Amazon. That I am actually talking to the person that I think I'm talking to. So I'm going to ask you some questions about how does that work? How do I get a certificate in order to do like an SSL communication, or perhaps what is the purpose for these certificates, and what all that kind of good stuff. Then we switch gears. Chapter 9, we're talking about the TPS. And remember how we talked about how the role of the TPS is really to just gather all this information and process it and move it on up the information pyramid. So questions like that. Processing types. You remember how we talked about online processing versus batch processing, that kinds of thing? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about here. So the next one is the objectives. And there was a cool little thing in there that talked about, what is the, what, if I'm putting a TPS in place, what are my goals here? What am I trying to do? And there was a whole bunch of them. They talked about, going in and, making sure I didn't have fraudulent transactions and being able to do this, with a whole list in there. If you can remember that from your notes, then you're kind of sort of good to go. Then we talk about the enterprise resource planning, the ERP folk. And they have an awful lot of advantages in using an ERP. And I'm going to talk about one specific one where you can get the most bang for the buck from a regard of being gaining efficiencies. Okay. Supply chain. So if you recall, they talked about supply chain it's everything from getting materials in all the way through manufacturing. I mean, it involves everything involved in the whole process. So you remember that discussion, you'll be good to go. ERPs are not fraught with problems. In fact, there was a discussion in lecture talking about how difficult these things are to do and all the things that could possibly go wrong. And there was even a study that talked about how many of them were complete failures. Chapter 10 talks about decision phases. So if you remember how we talked about this, how we had, you had problem solving, and then how you identified the problem, and then you did this, and so those phases of both decision making and problem solving. Put those two together in one. Okay, remember the structures? Unstructured and semi-structured and structured. It's all about, I pretty much will have all the information I need. I got most of the information I need, and I got missing one hell of a lot of information. The decision structures. Remember the discussion on models, where I go in there and I say I have an optimizing model and a satisficing model and heuristics. And this would be one of those good scenarios where I do a matching, match each of the following examples with the proper type of decision model. The next one is going to be using one of those catchphrases. So I'm going to ask you, what is the cool catchphrase that's used that's associated with the MIS systems. After that, we talk about report types. Remember how I made a distinction that you have scheduled reports and on-demand reports and all these drill-down reports and exception reports. I even went into a great deal of detail on a previous quiz about the exception report doesn't mean bad; it just means out of the ordinary. So I'm going to ask you some questions about reporting types. And then towards the end of Chapter 10, we have a discussion of the decision support system versus the MIS. So this would be, once again, would be one of those things where there's a cool chart, and it'd be kind of handy to have that kind of ready. It could be one of those, matching kind of things, or it could be which of the following are true of the comparison of a DSS versus an MIS. Next up, now we're into Chapter 11, knowledge management. And so I'm going to give you an example or two and say, is this legitimate knowledge management or not? So it's just going to be, is this a good example? Yes or no? Kind of a simple true-false question. I hope you guys can take that without too much trouble. The next one talks about the knowledge types. Remember the tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge, all that stuff? Remember all that? Okay. So, one is a little bit more difficult to write down or to automate, and the other is kind of sort of easy. Yeah. Okay, good. Expert systems. What's the overall purpose for an expert system? I mentioned the example I give, for example, in the lecture was like a loan, I'm a loan officer and yet I'm a junior loan officer. And so I use an expert system that helps me make decisions. And so is that replacing me, the operator, or is it replacing like the expert? Kind of interesting, huh? There's components of the expert system, and one of them was kind of odd, and so I talked about it. So I'm going to ask you a specific question about what is the purpose for this one feature, one component of an expert system. This next one on virtual reality, this is not in the book, but I even asked you in your journal, and a lot of people did not get this right, so pay attention. So I'm going to ask you some questions about virtual reality types, and what's a good example of one of those things. So pay attention. Next talks about game theory. Remember how if I'm trying to I'm the CDC and I'm trying to fight some infection, and you're trying to figure out, well, if I deploy people over here and the infection goes into this area, I'll have to deploy, it's like war games where you have to figure out, if I do this, they'll do this, and if I do this, they do this. That's what game theory is all about. There's very little to do with like video games. Chapter 12, of course, is changing subjects, and so we're talking about the system development life cycle. So I'm going to ask you about something about members of this team, more than likely, assuming that you have a team of people working on developing the system. I'm going to pick on one section and say, what do they do for a living? Project alignment. Whenever you're working with a list of incoming projects, you probably need to make sure that they keep aligned with what the business goals are. And there was a technique, there was a document, a way to do that. And if you can remember all of that, you're in good shape. Now this next one is kind of difficult to put a page number against, because I'm going to be asking you probably one of those, match each of the following phases with an example. Well, since the 6 phases, or 7 depending on how you count, are scattered over 2 chapters, I just put the page number for the first one, okay? So clearly it's not. This is all of the phases, not just the one that appears on page 555. So, which of the following, match each one of these with some sort of an example. It could be an example, it could be a phrase, it could be an output. What's associated with each one of these phases in the SDLC. Okay, this is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark, and we'll polish this thing off in just a few more minutes.